The western horizon did not glow with a standard sunset. It bled. It was a dense, expanding wall of atomic orange and suffocating graphite gray that rolled over the high ponderosa timber ridge of the Meyer rangeland in western Montana. It was a terrifying low-frequency roar that echoed through the stone foundations of the valley, a sound that Luke Meyer felt in the bone, marrow of his shins before the smoke ever touched his throat. To the State Disaster Command Unit stationed 4 miles down the valley, operating $500,000 worth of computerized thermal imaging rigs and automated fire spread predictive software, this specific mountain pass was already marked as a total loss grid. The incident engineers had certified that the timber moisture index had dropped past the historical critical failure point. They declared that the wind speed, combined with the dry brush density, made the fire mathematically unstoppable. Everything within 30 square miles was ordered evacuated, abandoned to the ash. Luke stood on the weathered timber planks of his family's equipment loading dock, his 54-year-old eyes squinting against the falling flakes of hot white ash. His throat was raw, covered in the fine, gray soot that had been drifting down from the mountains for 12 hours. Beside him sat his 82-year-old father, Caleb Meyer, whose hands were resting flat on the iron rim of a hand-forged heavy digging bar. Caleb's face was like a map of the Montana Territory itself, carved by 80 winters of dry prairie wind and lined with the deep, clean wrinkles that come from watching the sky for 3/4 of a century. For 60 years, the Meyer Ranch had been the unrecognized structural anchor of the valley. It was the place where old water systems were engineered by eye, where hand-dug irrigation ditches ran perfectly against the natural contours of the hills without the aid of a single laser level. But today, the modern world's metrics were collapsing. A fleet of state emergency response trucks tore up the gravel driveway, their electronic sirens wailing in a frantic rhythm. The district fire marshal, a 35-year-old tactical coordinator wearing fire-resistant polymer gear and checking a flashing satellite status screen every 10 seconds, ran toward the loading dock. "Mr. Meyer, you have to abandon the property immediately," the young officer shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of the heat signature reports on his screen. The predictive algorithm just recalculated the front line. The convection column has turned into a localized firestorm. The computer projects that the head of the fire will drop into this basin within 20 minutes. It's generating 3,000 BTUs per square foot. No human structure can survive the thermal density. Your cattle are gone, and your home is next. We have to clear the valley before the exit road is cut off. Caleb Meyer didn't lean forward to look at the tactical screen. He reached down into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of dry buffalo grass, and held it up between his thumb and forefinger, watching the way it tilted against the erratic, hot thermal drafts rushing down the ridge. "Your computer is looking at the timberline, son," the old man said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly registers that carried zero panic. "But it isn't looking at the pressure drop in the creek bed. That fire is moving fast because it's hungry for oxygen, not just because the wood is dry. If you run down that exit road now, your computerized trucks will stall out when the ambient air temperature hits 300 degrees and cuts your electronic fuel injectors. Then you'll be trapped in an iron box in the middle of a furnace." The young coordinator didn't argue. His satellite radio crackled violently with a voice from the primary command base. "Wind shear just deflected the front flank. The exit road is blocked by downed timber. Fire has jumped the highway. All units locked down inside protective structural shells. God help us." The sudden silence that settled over the ranch yard was absolute. The modern emergency trucks, with their computerized all-wheel drive systems and automated cabin filtration networks, were officially useless. The exit route was a wall of burning fuel. The 7 young engineers and coordinators stood in the middle of the gravel yard, their white hard hats reflecting the orange glare of the ridge, staring at their screens like men looking at a countdown clock that they couldn't pause. "We're locked in a dead zone," the supervisor whispered, his tablet screen turning red as the local cell towers melted on the mountain. The algorithmic fire model didn't account for a localized pressure collapse. "It says we have a 0% chance of survival if we stay in the path of the head fire." "Is there a concrete bunker here, a subterranean cellar?" "There's no bunker," Caleb said, stepping down from the wood planks, his heavy leather work boots finding stable placement on the dry soil. He walked deliberately toward the back corner of the old timber forge shed, a building that had survived the historic dry drought of 1936 and the Great Valley Fire of 1967. Beneath a stack of heavy iron plowshares and an old, Stationary steel anvil sat a thick slab of hand-poured unreinforced concrete. Caleb reached behind the old masonry forged chimney, pulling out a heavy, flat-iron pry bar that had been forged from an old railroad track. He jammed the edge into a hidden seam in the concrete floor. With a clean, heavy grunt, he heaved upward. The concrete didn't break. It rolled back on a pair of hidden iron hinges that his grandfather had oiled with animal fat nearly a century ago. Beneath the stone floor sat a rectangular iron chest sealed with heavy pre-war industrial wax. Caleb stripped away the protective coating with his thumb, revealing a heavy brass padlock from the old Milwaukee lockworks. From around his neck, beneath his grease-stained wool shirt, he pulled a flat brass key with 3 custom notches hand-filed into the shoulder. He inserted the key into the lock. There was no screech of old metal, no grinding of rust. With a clean, heavy click, the internal springs released. He threw back the lid. The young engineers crowded around, expecting to see emergency respirators, communication gear, or corporate insurance documents. Instead, the box was filled with heavy hand-forged steel tools, 3 leather-bound notebooks dating back to 1898, and a massive stack of oversized linen maps drawn with black India ink. "These are hand-drawn topographical wind flow charts," Thomas muttered, pulling out the first leather ledger. He flipped past pages of weather logs from the Great Depression until he found a section written in deep black ink titled Atmospheric Draft Manipulation During Forest Infernos. The young coordinator with the tablet shook his head in frustration. "Mr. Meyer, with all due respect, old maps and hand tools aren't going to stop a firestorm that's putting out 1,500 degrees of heat. We need water tankers, chemical retardant drops, heavy bulldozers. We can't fight an industrial disaster with a book of old field notes." "We aren't fighting the fire, son," Caleb said, his eyes scanning a precise hand-drawn formula detailing the exact volume of dry fuel required to alter a local convection column. "We're going to change the air pressure that's driving it. Your computers are trying to predict where the fire wants to go. My father taught me how to make the fire go where we want it to die." Caleb pointed his calloused finger at the India ink blueprint of the ranch basin. For 80 years, the Meyer family had cultivated a 300-acre field of high-density premium alfalfa and dry ryegrass directly to the west of the main house. To the modern environmental inspectors, it was just agricultural production land. But to the Meyer lineage, that field was a massive mechanical buffer. It was a perfectly flat expanse of open fuel, positioned exactly at the bottleneck where the mountain canyon opened into the valley basin. "Look at the ridge," Caleb commanded, forcing the young supervisor to look up past his tablet at the terrifying beauty of the descending front line. "The fire is moving down the canyon because the canyon acts like a chimney. It draws cold air from our valley up to feed the hot flame core on the peaks. Right now, that firestorm has a steady, predictable draft. If it reaches our tree line with that draft intact, the heat will flash fry everything in this valley in 60 seconds. The computer says hide because the computer assumes the chimney draft is an unalterable natural constant." He turned the page of the 1934 ledger, revealing a mathematical breakdown of localized thermal vacuums, a set of calculations that Caleb's grandfather had verified using nothing more than primitive glass barometers and coal fires. "When the big timber fire comes down the North Pass, do not wait for the water that will never arrive. The water will turn to steam before it hits the fuel. You must create a second chimney at the floor of the valley. If you light the flat fields exactly when the canyon wind reverses its ground pressure, the heat from your own field will create a massive, localized thermal column. That column will draw the oxygen away from the mountain front, starving the timber line, and forcing the main head of the fire to fold back on its own ash line. You must use the fire's own lungs to choke it to death." The younger engineer pulled out his digital calculator, his fingers flying across the keys as he cross-referenced Otto Meyer's fluid dynamic equations with the real-world heat signature figures on his tablet. His face went from pale to completely translucent. He's right about the thermal dynamics," the young man stammered, his hand shaking so hard he almost dropped the device. "If we ignite the 300 acres of dry rye grass right now, the upward convective lift will create a low-pressure zone at the base of the ridge. It will generate a counterdraft of nearly 40 miles per hour pulling toward our field. It will literally pull the front of the forest fire down out of the timber and onto the open dirt buffer before it can jump to the house. But if the timing is off by even 2 minutes, we'll just light our own execution pyre. We'll be caught between 2 fires with 0 oxygen left to breathe." "The timing won't be off," Caleb said, lifting a heavy, manual brass drip torch from the bottom of the iron chest. It was a tool built in 1942 filled with a precise, heavy mixture of raw kerosene and recycled motor oil. But to get the field ignited fast enough to match the canyon wind shift, we can't use your automated utility vehicles. Their electronic air intake sensors will detect the smoke density within 30 seconds and lock your computer transmissions into an unalterable safety shutdown mode. We need a machine that doesn't have a brain to get scared. Thomas didn't wait for a command. He ran to the back of the equipment, lean-to, and threw the canvas tarp off his grandfather's 1952 International Harvester crawler, a 12-ton heavy steel tractor with 0 electrical wires, 0 sensors, and a massive 4-cylinder direct-start diesel engine that used a pure mechanical injection pump. Using the custom hand-forged wrenches recovered from the concrete chest, Thomas bypassed the standard governor limits on the fuel rack based on a handwritten note from the 1967 ledger titled, "Overfueling Dynamics for Emergency Firebraking." He turned the heavy brass fuel screw 2 full turns clockwise, allowing the mechanical pump to deliver 40% more fuel directly into the combustion pre-chambers. He climbed onto the raw iron seat, his boots clearing the gray dust from the steel foot clutches. He pulled the manual compression lever, engaged the heavy auxiliary starter engine, and threw the main fuel lever forward. The crawler did not turn over with a smooth electronic hum. It exploded into life with a terrifying, rhythmic bark that threw a 2-foot column of pure black diesel soot into the orange air. It was a raw, industrial sound that shook the windows of the old stone house, a sound that carried the mechanical force of an era that didn't care about software. Limitations. Thomas backed the heavy steel machine out of the lean-to, its raw iron tracks clanking against the gravel with an ominous, military precision. He hooked a massive 15-foot wide manual disc plow, built from heavy cold-rolled steel plates that could cut through solid limestone to the tractor's solid drawbar. Caleb climbed onto the steel step behind the seat, his hand holding the manual fuel override lever steady, his eyes fixed on the smoke column descending the canyon walls. "Go!" Caleb yelled over the roar of the diesel engine. The pressure gauge on the old well just dropped 2 points. The wind shift is starting right now. Thomas threw the direct drive transmission into 3rd gear and dropped the heavy steel discs into the dry soil of the trophy alfalfa field. The 12-ton machine shuddered as the steel blades hit the hard-baked earth, but the overfueled engine didn't bog down. The turbocharger, a purely mechanical unit bolted to the exhaust manifold, screamed with a high-pitched note as the massive pistons hammered against the cylinder heads. The machine moved at an aggressive 6 miles an hour, tearing a wide black trench of raw, unburnable dirt along the eastern perimeter of the house, while Caleb held the brass drip torch over the side, leaving a long, burning line of kerosene fire directly in the path of the dry ryegrass. The young engineers stood on the gravel pad, watching in sheer horror as the old rancher intentionally set his own land on fire. Within 90 seconds, the 300-acre field was a wall of yellow flame that stood 40 feet into the air. The heat was immense, forcing the command crew to shield their faces behind the steel bodies of their emergency trucks. Then the miracle of ancestral physics occurred. As the flame from the flat field reached its peak thermal capacity, it didn't drift toward the house. The massive column of rising hot air created a violent artificial low-pressure zone at the floor of the valley. Suddenly, with a sound like a vacuum pump engaging, the wind completely reversed its direction. A 20-mile-per-hour wind that had been driving the wildfire down the mountain pass was instantly sucked backward toward the burning alfalfa field. The 70-foot-high timber fire descending the canyon walls met the massive counterdraft. The engineers watched their tablet screens in absolute disbelief as the fire spread vectors reversed on their digital maps. The main head of the forest fire was literally pulled out of the treetops, dragged downward by the low-pressure vortex onto the raw, plowed dirt buffer that Thomas had just cut with the International crawler. Starved of oxygen by the immense upward lift of the alfalfa fire, the main timber inferno did not jump the valley floor. It choked on its own vacuum. The flames folded inward, swirling in a massive, self-consuming spiral of white ash before dying out cleanly against the black dirt line. Within 7 minutes, the unstoppable firestorm that the state computers had certified as a total survival failure was reduced to nothing more than a smoldering line of dead coals on the rock shelf, while the old rancher's house and the entire livestock herd stood completely untouched in the clear center of the basin. By 6 o'clock that evening, the sky above the Montana basin had turned from blood orange to a quiet, smoky lavender. The mountain ridge was a black silhouette of dead stumps, but the air inside the Meyer yard was cool and clear. The modern emergency vehicles sat in a row, their electronic warning lights finally turning off as their safety systems detected normal atmospheric metrics. The young supervisor stood at Caleb Meyer's heavy oak kitchen table, his tablet completely dark, his hands carefully turning the yellowed pages of the 1898 ledger book. They spent $10 million developing our predictive fire modeling program in Denver, the young officer said, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet humility as he looked at the hand-drawn pressure diagrams. The software uses satellite metadata, atmospheric moisture constants, and fuel load algorithms to calculate containment borders. But it's all designed under the assumption that the operator is a passive observer who just follows the evacuation prompts on the screen. It never occurred to the software developers that a human being could look at a fire, calculate its lung capacity, and use a 12-ton piece of analog iron to rip the air right out of its throat. He looked up at Caleb, who was cleaning the brass tip of his 1942 drip torch with an old piece of oilcloth. If you hadn't opened this box, if you had followed our protocol and evacuated when the computer gave the prompt, we would have been caught on that. Mountain Exit Road when the engine computers triggered the thermal lockdown. Your grandfather's field logs didn't just save your ranch, Mr. Meyer. They saved our lives. Caleb took a slow sip of his black coffee, his calloused thumb tracing the stamped initials OM on the iron wrench resting beside his mug. The problem with digital thinking isn't that the computers are wrong, the old man said, looking through the window at the smoldering ridgeline. The problem is that a computer only knows what the programmer thought could happen on a normal day. It's built to limit the risk, to protect the equipment warranty, to follow the safety guidelines. But a natural disaster doesn't care about warranties. When the world goes off-grid, when the fire reaches 1500 degrees, the smart machine turns itself off because it doesn't know how to sacrifice its own parts to survive. That's when you need the old iron. You need a machine that doesn't know how to quit, and an operator who knows how to read the wind with his own skin. He turned back to the stack of linen maps, carefully rolling them up and tying them tight with the old hemp twine before placing them back into the cold-rolled steel vault beneath the kitchen floorboards. The state can install their new digital sensors on the ridge walls next week, Caleb said, closing the heavy steel lid of the toolbox with a clean, solid slam that echoed through the quiet house. They can track the humidity using their satellite uplinks, but my grandson turns 14 next month. On his birthday, he's not getting a computer upgrade. He's going to stand right here in this kitchen, and we're going to open Otto's 1930 field notebook. He's going to learn how to read the clouds before he learns how to read a touchscreen. Because when the grid fails, and it always does when the heat gets high enough, the world is going to need men who can pick up a hand-forged pry bar and hold the line.